All right. So, so today we're going to start in on chapter 17, talking all about culture and personality. So I think that this chapter is particularly interesting. I mean, I like the sex and gender chapter, okay, but honestly, it's not my favorite. So we'll get to cover some really interesting things in this chapter that look at how personality and culture really interact with one another. So I want to begin by going over an illustration of some cultural differences in moral values. So some of these are in your textbook, incidentally. There's it's on page 527 and 528. There's a little exercise about these, but I thought it'd be interesting to do it in class. So you don't have to copy these down. You want to just look at them in the textbook. So for each one of these that I put up, I want you to raise your hand if you perceive this as a violation of a moral value. Right. So here's our first one. Your cousin eats beef twice a week. Nobody thinks that's wrong? No vegans? No. Okay. So how about this one? One of your relatives dies and has an unequal inheritance with more going to men than women. All right, so a few hands going up here. Here's our next one. A woman is playing cards at home with her friends and her husband cooks rice for them.
Cool.
That works for you?
That would never happen.
Okay. So no hands going up here. Some approval. Next one. A man beats his wife for going to the movies without his permission. All right, lots of hands going up here. Don't like that one. At night, a wife asks her husband to massage her legs. Okay, no disapproval there. Occasionally I'll get a student saying, when was the last time she shaved? But no protests here. All right, and our last one. A parent punishes their child by hitting her with a stick. Right. So it's like maybe half of you or so are kind of opposed to that. Right now, I put this up here because for 1, 3, and 5, the odd-numbered ones, most Americans don't view any kind of moral violation occurring there. However, in this one specific culture, and again your book talks more about this, a subculture within India, the Brahmin Indian culture, these things are all viewed as fairly serious moral violations. And then the even-numbered ones, 2, 4, and 6, are both viewed as pretty much okay over there, but a lot of people over here have some problems with those. So this is an example of something that we'll actually talk more about on Wednesday called transmitted culture. So we learn a lot about moral values from others. There are a few things that are fairly universal, which we'll also talk about. But your book goes into some more detail. It's really interesting. I was looking over this earlier in case you haven't seen this. One of the items that I didn't have on here was a widow in your community eats fish 2 or 3 times a week. And then they were doing interviews with some of these folks, and this person from that Brahmin culture says, in response to the question, is the widow's behavior wrong? They say, yes, widows should not eat fish, meat, onions, or garlic, or any hot foods. They must restrict their diets to cool foods like rice, dal, ghee, and vegetables. How serious is the violation? The interviewer asks. A very serious violation. She will suffer greatly if she eats fish. Is it a sin? Yes, it is a great sin. What if no one knew this had been done? It is still wrong. A widow should spend her time seeking salvation, seeking to be reunited with the soul of her husband. Hot foods will distract her. They will stimulate her sexual appetite. She will lose her sanctity. She will want sex and behave like a whore. She will offend his spirit if she eats fish. So, again, that's something that you would not expect to hear many Americans saying, but it's a pretty strongly held belief over there. So, so this is all the domain of cultural personality psychology. We'll talk about Borat in just a second. So there are some aspects of personality that differ from one culture to the next. So we talked about differences in moral values just then. But there are other things that you're probably more familiar with, like the warmth of a greeting. So some cultures, they'll walk up and hug you, give you a kiss on the cheek. Others might be more of a handshake or bowing. So just a lot of differences between those types of things. But other aspects of personality are fairly universal. So they're shared by people no matter where you go. People have similar types of attitudes regarding certain things. So an example of a cultural universal that we'll talk about on Wednesday is viewing incest as a bad thing. Particularly, an incest is defined as parent-child sexual relations. That's universally viewed as being something bad. And we'll talk about why that is when we get to that point. But has anybody ever seen, I take it from your laugh that you're somewhat familiar with the Borat character? So what does Borat do in these skits? It's a fictional character, but it serves to illustrate a point. So,
He's like a newscaster.
okay, yeah, so he plays the role of a person who comes over to America from Kazakhstan, which most Americans know absolutely nothing about. And then he infiltrates all these high society type things, sometimes posing as someone who's doing a news report or some type of a documentary. And he engages in all of these unacceptable behaviors. And so it's funny because you get to see these other people react to him talking about things like bodily functions and sexual activity at this high society dinner. But they kind of tolerate him because they understand he's from another culture, or they believe that anyway. And hilarity ensues. Yeah. So this illustrates that even though this is a fictional example, if you did bring someone in from one of these cultures, like the Brahmin Indian culture, you would expect them to run into a lot of issues blending with people from our culture. So. Actually, ECU has an interesting, I think it's called the Global Learning Initiative, where there's actually a class run by one of our psychology faculty, Rosina Chaya, and it involves students actually video conferencing with people in these cultures that are very different from our own and actually engaging in a dialogue with those folks. So that sounds like a really cool class. If I were a student here, I would want to take that. So I had to put in a plug for that. So. Cultural personality psychology involves the study of cultural variations, so things like within group similarities and between group differences. So how are people from these two cultures the same, and what are the differences between cultures? And so this can apply to pretty much any of the subject matter within psychology, looking for cross-cultural similarities and differences. So anything we've talked about previously in the class, or anything that we'll talk about for the remainder of the course. So this could be things as basic as physical differences, or basic psychological differences, differences in perception. Could be behavioral differences. So there are a lot of behaviors that people in other cultures perform regularly that we really don't, or different ways of doing things. And most commonly, researchers will study differences in attitudes, just like we saw with the moral attitudes, attitudinal differences. Now, there isn't nearly as much of this research as there is, say, research from trait psychology, and this is primarily because of the fact that this is much more challenging to do. So you have to overcome language barriers, and you have to often have collaborators in these other countries if you're a researcher who wants to do this type of a thing, or travel to one of these exotic countries yourself. And so it's a lot harder than just getting a sample of undergraduate psychology students and handing them a self-report scale. But it does collect some really valuable data. So there are three primary goals of personality psychology. They're cultural personality psychology, that is. So these folks want to discover the principles underlying cultural diversity. So, in other words, we know that there are a lot of differences between people from country A and country B, but why? Does it have to do with history? Does it have to do with something in their modern environment? So they'll look at how human psychology shapes culture. And then they'll look at the reverse, how culture shapes psychology. So there's quite an interaction that can go on here. We have certain things that are coded in our genes to some degree that can shape our culture. So I think my favorite example of this is going back to the incest example. So there are genetic predispositions to avoid incestual relations. And so there's a really fascinating hypothesis. I may be jumping the gun going into this, but it's interesting. It's called the Westermarck hypothesis, that suggests that there's a critical period during childhood, and then if you're around a member of the opposite sex during that critical period, then as an adult you will find them to be less appealing in many ways. They'll be less sexually appealing. And so this supposedly helps people who were around, say, siblings during that critical period in youth to avoid them as potential sexual partners when they reach adulthood. And so because that is part of human biology, in a sense, then that influences our psychology and in turn shapes our culture, so that there are these universal rules against incest. But as we'll see today, the culture can shape psychology as well. So you can learn certain things that affect how you perceive the world.
Going along with the incest thing, in some like South Pacific islands, whenever they're real young, they separate the siblings completely so that they can't go around them, since incest is such a taboo. So that's how their culture shapes their psychology. But I'm usually too.
Okay, yeah. So that can happen a lot of times, where the culture actually reinforces something within the psychology, like you were saying. And so there's just a lot of neat cross-cultural examples of this. So there are three major approaches to studying culture and the influence that culture has on personality that we'll talk about in this class. So we will first talk about evoked culture. And so this is going to deal with how environmental factors shape people's personality. And we're going to cover this today for the rest of the lecture. And then starting on Wednesday, we'll talk about transmitted culture. And we just mentioned this regarding moral values. So some are universal, like incest avoidance, but a lot of them are transmitted. So these are often influenced by social factors. Other people teach us what is right and wrong, or we might learn from example. And then finally, we'll talk about cultural universals. So these are those things I was talking about that are just the same pretty much everywhere that you go. And so a lot of times these will reflect some type of underlying biological factor. Although this can be a controversial claim. I know that certain members of the psychology faculty here are really opposed to this whole idea that biology can have any kind of a strong influence on something like moral values. All right. So let's begin by going over evoked culture and talking about some of the research that has come from that perspective.